AngularJS is a user interface framework. It makes it simple to build the front-end portion of a web application. It's open source under the MIT license. The MIT license lets you use the code for any purposes, including commercial purposes, with very few restrictions or requirements. Angular was originally developed by a group of developers who worked for a company called Brat Tech LLC. Later on, some of the developers, including Misko Hevery, joined Google and continued to work on the framework. They eventually used it for Google projects, and Google began to fund and promote it. There are many frameworks out there that try to make it easier to build rich user interfaces in JavaScript. AngularJS takes a different approach from other popular tools like jQuery. It's a higher-level application framework, whereas jQuery and similar tools are about making it easy to manipulate the document object model. What's different and what can AngularJS offer us? Well, three things stand out. First, two-way data binding lets us manipulate the display with much less code than jQuery. In fact, we get away from touching the document object model almost entirely. Second, HTML templates allow us to add complex content into the DOM structure without having to do the complex DOM manipulations that would be tedious with the basic DOM API, or even with jQuery. Third, it includes a module and dependency injection system that makes it pretty painless to write single-page applications. So in summary, if you're writing an SPA-style application or doing any kind of complex display in a browser, AngularJS is a great framework to choose. Traditional web applications build HTML on the server side using templating technologies like JSP, ASP, or PHP. Page flow was traditionally done on the server side as well, by things like Java servlets or Spring controllers. We can also move this logic into the browser and create a single-page application. AngularJS helps us move the complete user interface to the browser side. In essence, an Angular application runs the complete user interface in JavaScript on the browser. This user interface communicates with the back-end business logic and storage by using HTTP requests to RESTful web services. So clearly, AngularJS is more than a DOM API wrapper. As a result, there's a bit of a learning curve, but the payoff is pretty rich. You can download AngularJS from the AngularJS website. It's packaged as a JavaScript file that you can reference in your HTML page using the script tag. The script is going to be loaded whenever you load the page, so there's a few things we should do to speed things up. In production, you should use the minified version of the library. Also, you should enable gzip compression in your web server. Alternately, you can load the file from Google's Content Delivery Network. Enough talking about Angular, let's have a look at it. Here's a very simple AngularJS application. Right. When I type hello world, we can see the text below it update while I'm typing. Just this is pretty impressive behavior as opposed to traditional web apps where I'd have to type into a form, then submit the form to get a response. Let's take a look at the HTML source file. As you can see, we have a script callout that loads up the AngularJS library. Look at the body element. We've added an extra attribute, ng-app, that isn't actually part of HTML or HTML5. ng stands for Angular, and ng-app designates the DOM element that contains our application. Angular treats this as the root of the application and only looks at the DOM from this element down. On the input element here, we attached an attribute ng-model equals message. Angular picks up on this attribute and creates a connection between this input element and a variable called message. This is a two-way connection, so if message had some value at the start, it would appear in the input box. And then, as the user types in the input, whatever the user types gets put into the variable called message. Now, inside this paragraph tag, we have a funny-looking expression, message, inside double curly braces. This is what we call a template expression. And when we show this page in the browser, Angular is going to replace this expression with the current value of the message variable. Here are a few definitions for things that we use inside Angular applications. Directives are custom HTML elements or attributes like ng-app, ng-model, ng-repeat that encapsulate display rendering logic. Filters format data for output. For instance, there's a currency filter that formats a number into a currency appropriate for the browser's current locale. Services contain pure JavaScript logic without any concern for how the data is displayed or where the data comes from. In most complex applications, services invoke remote web services to access server-side business logic and data. Providers are JavaScript components that we use to configure services. Controllers handle user input events and control the page flow. A module is a package that contains a collection of other components like directives, controllers, and filters. MVC, or Model View Controller, is a well-known pattern for graphical user interface applications. It emphasizes separation of concerns, testability, and code reuse. The terminology goes back to the Smalltalk GUI system in 1977, and the general concept has been used in many user interface systems. AngularJS uses a variation of MVC to organize the user interface code. In MVC, the model is an in-memory, programmer-friendly representation of the data that we're going to show on the screen. The controller is a piece of code that's responsible for interpreting user input and responding to it. Typically, that response is to change the data that's in the model, but it could also involve going out to back-end logic in response to a user action. The view looks after showing the data to the user. In Angular, the model data is held in a series of interconnected scopes that are accessible from the JavaScript code in the controller and from the HTML templates that form the view. Controllers in Angular are JavaScript objects that are accessible from the view, and the view is contained in the templates that look like plain HTML with Angular directives and template expressions added to them. Angular translates these templates into document object model nodes for the browser to display. Let's flesh out this idea with a quick example. We'll build a login screen with some simple logic. If Daffy Duck tries to log in, we'll say no, but anyone else can log in without a problem. We'll start with the view. Here again we've got a basic HTML page. We put an ng-app attribute on the body element. In this case, we're setting the value of ng-app to simple app, which is going to be the name of the module that holds all the coded components of the app. We also set the ng-controller attribute to login control, which is the name of a controller that we'll define inside that module. We have two script callouts, one to load AngularJS and one to load our application scripts. That's called login.js here. On our input elements, we put ng-model attributes with the location of the variables that we want to have tied to the inputs. You might notice that the expressions look a lot like JavaScript. They're not, but the expression language is designed to be familiar and comfortable to JavaScript developers. On the button element, we put an ng-click attribute with a call to a login function. And finally, take a look at the template expression here. It's going to show the value of message on the screen. Okay, let's take a look at the controller. This code is defined in the login.js file that we mentioned earlier. The call to angular.module creates a new module called simpleApp. Then we're defining a controller on that module by calling the controller function. We hand it the name of the controller and a function that Angular will use to create the controller when it needs it. It's basically a constructor function for a controller object. In this case, we're handing it a function that takes a single argument, $scope. When Angular calls the function, it will provide a scope object for the $scope parameter. This scope object is the storage area that the controller shares with the view, so it's a good place to put objects that we'd like to render in the view. We can also put functions in the scope, like we're doing here with a function that we're storing in $scope.login. This is the function that our login button is going to call. It performs our simulated login logic. We can display data using the templating or one-way data binding. For input form elements, we use two-way data binding. When the input element is first shown, the value is set to the value of the bound object. Then, when the user interacts with the data element, the bound object or variable gets updated with the user's changes. Dependency injection lets you use objects without knowing how or when the objects are created. The framework just magically hands you the objects that you need, and the objects are already set up and ready for use. If object A depends on object B, and B depends on C, then the entire chain of dependencies will be initialized. That means that you as a programmer have less work to do for the object's life cycles. Also, when you're testing, we can inject mock objects easily. In AngularJS, objects are usually injected in the initialization functions of controllers or services. The system looks at the names of parameters to the functions we specify, and will inject the named object automatically when it calls the function. Okay, let's summarize this module. AngularJS is an open-source JavaScript-based web application framework. It uses the model view controller concept to build rich user interfaces in the browser. Angular supports both one-way and two-way data binding. That allows us to update the display just by changing data values, rather than doing complicated work on the document object model. Angular structures your code through the use of modules, and it helps keep a clear separation of concerns between the various MVC components.